Hello everybody and welcome back to some Dwarf Fortress lore. This is part 2 of Archcrystal, or Archcrystal the Final Chapters. Archcrystal is a very large Dwarf Fortress fanfiction which was recently finished by its author Sathatos. I did a video covering the chapters up until this point a couple of weeks ago, and there's a link to it down in the description and you can see the thumbnail on the screen right now. If you haven't yet watched that video, I do highly recommend you watch that first, as it is the entire story up until this point. This is the final chapters, so the chapters that follow after the previous portions of the story had finished. It gets a little out there at points and kind of reaches outside of what Dwarf Fortress itself is capable of, but it should be a fun ride. If you would like to just watch this part, it might stand on its own 2 feet, but if you haven't yet, please, once again, I recommend you either read the original story up until this point or watch the previous video. Or, alternatively, there is a link down in the description to the PDF file itself. It's on the Dwarf Fortress File Depot. It's just a PDF with the entire story up until this point. Whatever works best for you, it works for me. Thank you very much to Sathatos for writing this beautiful story, and shoutouts to everybody who is watching this video. So, without further delay, I just have to say, if you enjoy content like this, check out my Patreon and help me keep this stuff funded. And let's dive in to the final chapters of Archcrystal. The dwarves were doomed. Had it not been for one who recently came to understand the concept of existence, where forever held a reality. Fath's detriments became his strengths, and his esoteric arguments over infinite time became the backbone of the Defender's resolve. As he stood at the gates of hell, looking through the walls of Archcrystal, he was about to attempt something that he swore he would never do. Fath smiled, a hopeless smile, as he stood before the glass walls. Time seemed to slow around him, and a concentrated silence emerged within the dwarven defenders as the demons continued to crash the gates in front of them. The juxtaposition between the raging cacophony outside of the sudden stillness had an eerie, impacted atmosphere of importance that was peculiar in its uncertainty. All dwarven eyes turned to Fath, standing silently at the artifact door. Back slightly hunched with a burden that ignored physical age, but listened to an emotional one. Slowly, the dwarves defending the walls stopped what they were doing and turned towards him with a frightened expectation. Surely there was nothing he could do on his own to turn back the demon army. In their heart of hearts, they had realized what the demons possessed: a will and lifespan to outlast them. And it didn't mean that they would give up, but facing an enemy that time cannot defeat becomes increasingly futile. The knowledge of this would weigh down any combatant, increments of sand that slowly buries the determined and talented in a grave of constant inevitability. The depth of the grave never matters, and neither do the contents after a while. The weight of Fath's heart dragged behind him as he forced himself towards the battle. He had come to hate war, and he would rather see the world live as harmoniously as possible, but that was never an option here. Archcrystal, a monument that spat in the face of inevitable time, while time simply nodded and smiled knowingly. But Fath knew that moments like this were why he lived, and why anyone did. As they condensed the immense design of things into what mattered, or at least split in what had to matter, and what ultimately must not, he wondered if he had the will to do what he ultimately must. This was not hell, Fath thought. Hell is made by minds and hearts who know compassion and charity, but choose to bring misery and suffering. There would be no misery like that which he could bring, and it was a choice to do so, despite knowing and feeling the opposite. It was a curse that was cruel and vicious, by the decision to do it in spite of sympathy and grace that could be given otherwise. As Fath raised his hand to shudder the dead to animate, another hand grabbed his wrist. Surprised, he slowly turned his head to see who would defy him, his ego driving a self-imposed sadness to wonder what dared to disturb him, his moment that he had forced himself to believe was inevitable and profound. It was Meng, catatonic and insane, apprentice of Edzul, the great last mathematician. Years before she had attempted to compile all of Edzul Ironsword's teachings into one codex. Shortly after starting her work, she was found sitting on the floor of the library, staring off into space, unblinking and unspeaking. They placed her into a cell where they fed and cared for her, thinking that she may never speak again, until now. "No," she forced out, as she clutched Fath's wrist. It was the first word she had spoken in years, and it carried a weight despite its mouse-like pitch. "No," she repeated, and her eyes focused this time instead of looking through him at some imaginary point miles away. Fath recoiled reflexively and looked on her as anyone did. The absence of kindness was burning bright in his state, but urgency made him stop. "No," she repeated, again and tilted her head. Fath paused for long enough to consider her meaning for the first explosion to pierce his ears. Minecarts filled with lead coins dropped from newly finished settings to travel at breakneck speeds and then come to a sudden stop at the fortifications, releasing their deadly cargo onto the demonic assembly, who stared at it with unknowing comprehension. The missiles they had created tore through everything in front of them. Whether they spit, webbed, or breathed fire, there is no sound like a demon from hell screaming for its life as it's ripped apart by projectiles, traveling at 1,000 meters per second. Pieces of their flesh exploded off as they writhed back and forth during the infinite rain of metal bullets that blew apart the slayed walls behind them, piercing the melodic demonic cries of agony split in the air of the underworld. As the dwarves prepared to fire the collective hearts of their arsenal labor forth onto them, a weapon born of their industry and passion and profound history. While the demons learned patience from the dwarves had learned to pour their malice into the technological terrors they had invented. And while it would have reciprocal effects far in the future, the dwarves of Archcrystal, yet again, held the acme of delivering efficient and horrifying death and destruction to their enemies. The demons attempted to counterattack by holding dead bodies of their fallen up as shields as they again rushed the entrance in mass, but the large groups they clustered in made for perfect targets for the arrays of hundreds of lead ammunition that fired continuously into them without discrimination. The repeated mechanisms of the minecarts ensured a steady rhythm of casualty and fatality, and torn a sign and muscle of those invaders caught in the metal kill zone emitted from the fortifications without reprieve. Steady streams of targets continued to march forth, and their ranks were mowed down by the physics of dwarven automation that exploded from the glass ramparts, reliable in its constant and unrelenting drumbeat of mechanical death. The new masters of hell were cold and metallic, and the fear of fire and brimstone were rendered obsolete. An hour later, the battlefield in front of Archcrystal lay silent. The smoking ruins of the dead demons counted by the thousands were an inspiring and horrible reminder that the meaning of hell had changed forever, from a monstrous population of demonic creatures into a callous race of mortals who could care, but decided not to. 14th of Moonstone, year 542, 470th year of Archcrystal. The final gathering. Soltrangus had packed his meager belongings and was ready for his long journey to Archcrystal. The neighboring elves were constantly harassing his local hillocks, and he had finally had enough. The elves justified their raids by saying that the war machine of Archcrystal was destroying the land in its constant reach outwards for territory. But it was the same land that had nearly killed his ancestors with beasts and poisonous plants and infectious diseases until they had finally carved out a small home in the hills. He had decided that the ambivalent land deserved its reckoning, and the war machine scorch the unforgiving plains and animals. He preferred to live underground anyways, and Sultangus started walking and made sure to step on any flowers he could. Uller was tired of being conscripted into the military to defend his dwarven fortress of quested ceiling. A scholar at heart, he yearned to discuss the study of mathematics, and he knew that most of the literature on the subject came from the capital of Archcrystal, now the political and intellectual and geographical center of the world. Copies of Edzul Ironsword's glass codexes had made their way to his fortress, and he was ravenous to read more. Living in hell did not scare him as long as there were books to read, so he began his journey to Archcrystal, the spire, full of hope and ambition, and his sights were set on unlocking the secrets of the world. Gitzo, the local sheriff, ran a tight ship in his fortress of tinbucks. To put it lightly, he felt that he understood that order was the purest form of existence, and that cruelty was the purest form of order, so much that his punishments were horrible and quick. But he also felt that his methods were unappreciated here, and he had heard stories of the famous sheriff of Archcrystal, Doran Lashgrooved, and he made the decision to immigrate. He packed his steel whip and other instruments of justice and set out alone to join the fortress guard. He fantasized of torturing horrible truths out of a demon, and this gave him an exhilarating bounce in his step as he traveled. Gering, Imek, Sam, and Splint strapped their weapons to their backs and prepared to leave Granite Birds. The four friends enjoyed their military careers in the old mountain halls, but were tired of being outranked by the pompous idiots of Archcrystal, so they all decided it was time to become one of those pompous idiots and turn the tables. They knew that migrants were all given a brand new equipment and sent out immediately, so they packed light and set off for their 4-day journey to the capital. "I hate bars and live music," Livos muttered under his breath in the loud tavern called the Wild Belly. Every part of dwarven happiness made him feel uncomfortable, and he had longed for a good seat in a quiet room. It didn't help that he was actually rather engaging in conversation and could fake interest incredibly well, but these traits were poison to someone who preferred to be alone. He was a worshipper of Shin, the god of the moon and sky, which set him further apart from his underground brethren. This was also why he had come to Archcrystal, for they had the only dedicated temple to Shim in the world. "Excuse me?" Livos tipped the shoulder of a nearby patron. "Where is the temple to Shin?" "What? Shin?" said the patron. "That old place?" Livos nodded, and the dwarf beside him rolled his eyes and simply pointed up. Livos stared up through the glass floors and cursed under his breath. "Of course it is." Flame, the metalsmith, had recently been exiled from his 7th Hillix in 3 months for what they called tantrums. And they've all gone soft with their manners and civilization and basic dwarven decency to wear pants. And he thought to himself, a long beard used to be the only clothing a good dwarf needed. And settlements usually welcomed a master metalsmith with open arms, but Flame insisted on only working with his favorite metal, lead. He made everything out of it. Cups, splints, lead buckets. Everyone always whined, "It's too heavy to use a lead cage, and I don't feel good when I drink from this cup," etc. Get stronger then, he thought. He hugged all of his lead creations and packed his wagon with all of his heavy belongings before heading to the last settlement in the Dipped Spears, the capital of Archcrystal. The ingredients were as plain as ever. The three looked down at their creation, for the Duke of Wasp Wax, with disdain and worried glances. It didn't take long for them to be banished by the Duke's foul temper. Crafter and Sanctum and Shimmy sat outside of the gates of the city of discussing their move. What if we're actually bad at cooking? Yeah, well, if we're good at it, we would be successful by now. Crafter, the cheesemaker, gave them both a scolding look. Get that nonsense out of your heads. We just haven't found the right ingredients yet. Talent has to meet opportunity, and there's only one place that we can find it. Fi looked around at the glass library and let out a low whistle. She had heard this place described before, but the novelty of seeing it for the first time was stunning. As a scholar, all of these books concentrated and controlled in one place. No wonder Archcrystal ruled the world. They controlled the access to education and kept it literally out of reach for anyone else. The botanist had little time before she was noticed among the latest wave of new migrants, and she reached into her bag and pulled out one of the many jute leaf quires and a sage of leaves and began copying. Cap, the weaponsmith, had barely had time to register what was happening before he was pulled out of line at the latest arrival processing session in Archcrystal. Most of his friends were being given weapons and armor and then sent off to war, but he was being led down a different hallway to the north. Looking through the glass walls, he could tell quite easily that they were prison cells, and not a place he wanted to be. A guard was seated and nodded as they approached, and Cap the soldier walked briskly past the guard and followed until they came to a door at the end. "Open it," the soldier commanded. Inside was a large dark cell, and in the corner of the fortress. Even though the glass was clear, there was a very little light coming to the room, making it hard to see. He could make out a dwarf crouched in the corner of the bed and a large object covered by a blanket to his right. Flame the metalsmith looked up from his bed and spoke in an unnaturally high-pitched voice. "Did you bring me the Archmage?" The guard rolled his eyes briefly and gestured. Yes, he's right here. This is Captain Archmage. He can help you." Flame turned his back, and Cap looked incredulously at the soldier who whispered, "You're a mechanic, right?" Cap nodded slowly. "Good. We need you to tell us something." And the soldier stepped forward and pulled the blanket back, revealing a large metal machine. What the hell is he building? First of Granite, year 572. 500th year of Archcrystal. The immense design of things. Ezost the demon slithered through his slayed fortress relentlessly. His goblin empire was crumbling, and all of his forces lay smashed around his final stronghold. And he felt haunted by the dwarves of Archcrystal, who had laid siege to the slayed tower for years now. And the last of its inhabitants were nearly starving, or mutinous, or both. Every plan to stop them had been met with defeat, and he was running out of options. Save one. It was forbidden that he use it. Part of the deal struck long ago at the beginning. He knew it was desperate now, and there were rumors that the dwarf necromancer of Archcrystal knew of its existence. And if that final secret was discovered by them, he shuddered. It was said that demons felt no fear, so the sensation, traveling through his nervous system, was cold and foreign to him, like being lost on an endless glacier. His clawed hand was shaking. He turned the ancient bronze key into the door of Slade again and opened it. There was still demons loyal to him here, and they were apprehensive now, and the sting of their last attack all those years ago still fresh in their long memories. The glowing pits reflected a mindful mortality in their eyes, and Ezost nodded at them, and they began their long, slow journey across the desolate plains of hell, to a place, ironically, close to where Archcrystal stood, a place none of them had ever dared to go. The fortress of Archcrystal stood as impenetrable as ever, its high glass parapets on the surface shining in the sunlight, and its labyrinthine architecture in hell awash with an eternal pulsing glow. But there was hidden rot within its walls. It wasn't new, but it had persisted slowly and relentlessly. It needed vast amounts of immigration now to support the population, as most of the original inhabitants had foregone having children long ago. But at first it was seen as a boon, having crafts dwarves of all kinds prop up the capital's economy, while the original inhabitants could descend further into decadence and hedonism. It would have worked if they had offered the same living standards to them, but the glassmakers weren't making any more bedrooms, and even the extra ones were claimed by the mushroom-hunting aristocracy. Consequently, the thousands of newcomers were forced to find shelter in the statue gardens and hallways, and even the tombs, and their dream for a better life quickly became a nightmare, as they were also treated poorly by the original residents, who had grown racist to their own species. Fath pondered this as he entered Doran's tomb, which he often did, recently to reflect and meditate. There was a family huddled in the corner trying to move something heavy, which he ignored reflexively. He sat down in Doran's old wooden folding chair and table, which were the only objects of his stored there. The old wood was decaying badly, and Fath couldn't bring himself to attempt to fix the rotting wood. He had a certain reverence for old objects like artifacts, and believed them to be perfect as they were. But this time was different. He slumped into the chair and leaned forward onto the table, and both crumbled under the pressure, sending Fath reeling to the floor amidst a cloud of splinters and sawdust. Coughing, he stood up and looked incredulously at the floor. What he had done, it was a heartbreaking sight, and he felt as if a small piece of him had suddenly been lost. He sat down between the rubble of the chair and the table, and put his face in his hands. A moment later, he felt a hand on his shoulder, and he looked up. One member of the family he had ignored was offering him a cup full of Plump Helmet wine. Fath looked at the young adult dwarf strangely before accepting it and thanking her. He took a few long sips before absent-mindedly sifting through the rubble with his free hand until something odd caught his eye. On the right side, underneath the table, he could make out some kind of carving. It had been hidden by the small drawer, now lay in pieces on the glass floor. He grasped the broken piece and blew away the dust from the inscription. It was a sentence. Hell lies, the immense design of things. But it seemed to be missing something at the beginning because there was a broken piece absent, and what looked like the end of a letter scratched before the word hell. It was a small piece, so probably only one word, and Fath sifted through all of the pieces until he finally found what he was looking for. The small piece was fortunately intact and fit perfectly, and he stared for a long moment at the complete message before him. The first word was beneath. Beneath hell lies the immense design of things. Fi was in the library studying when Fath strode in purposefully. She looked up from her book only passively before returning to the text. The sound of Fath rifling through bookshelves brought her eyes back up to him in annoyance. He was searching feverishly for something, making a mess. The only other scholar present was a ruler, who walked over and asked if they could help. I need every book written by Edsel Ironsword, said Fath in a low growl. A ruler knew the books well, so he started to assist, and eventually Fi's interest got the better of her, and she came over and asked, What are you looking for in them, Fath? A diagram! Measurements of the pits. The pits? Asked Fi. The glowing pits beneath Archcrystal were a void, so far as anyone knew. The cliffs were all straight down with no ledges or change in angle. Nothing ever came up out of them, and nothing that fell into them ever returned. In fact, the dwarves of Archcrystal disposed of their garbage into them, because it was much more efficient than incinerating it with magma. There, said a ruler. I think this might be the one that you're looking for. And Fath looked through the pages until at last he found a section he was searching for. The diagrams did indeed measure the glowing pits beneath Archcrystal. How far apart they were, slopes, angles, and they all had the same depth. Infinite, except one. Occasionally, over the centuries, the dwarves of Archcrystal had taken scouting parties outside of the walls into the Slade Caverns. Doran had led most of them, and consequently, they had maps of the surrounding area of the fortress. Fath's attention lingered on the spot about 3 kilometers north, where Edzul had made a few notes. On the slopes of the pits, they changed from acute to obtuse at varying depths. Although it was clear he hadn't had the time to take proper measurements, as the writing seemed scribbled and rushed. The depth simply read, "Infinite?" "Did you find what you were looking for?" asked a ruler. "Not yet, but I think I'm about to. I think we're going to need a scouting party to search this area of the fortress," said Fath, as he marched towards the library doors. Fi scoffed. "And how many dwarves do you think will sign up for that?" Fath shrugged. "The ones I ordered to." Cap was sitting on his desk outside of the cell he had guarded for decades when Gitzo came walking down the hallway beside him. Was Fath, whom he recognized immediately from his confident and arrogant stride, not to mention his shimmering clothes of adamantine and gold foil. Cap stood at attention where they approached. Gitzo nodded. "Cap, is the machine finished?" "Only the madman can know that for sure," said Cap, and he opened the door to the cell. "I've tried to make sense of it as best I could, but I don't completely understand it. Truthfully, I just helped him assemble it." And he nodded at Fath, who inclined his head back to him. "Plus, it's never been tested." "How do you know?" asked Fath. "Because he is still alive," replied Cap. Inside the cell was Flame, the metalsmith prisoner, clearly trapped within his own ramblings as he polished the machine. It was a large metal device the size of about 3 large horses, and at the front was a triangular metal plate that sloped back at the top and bottom. It was as wide as it was high, and even the metal slit at the center, almost resembling a large spear point. Behind that were 3 large cylinders, about 1 meter in diameter, and maybe half a meter tall, that fed into the front of the slit. At the back of the machine was a even larger cylinder that was very high and reached almost to the ceiling. It had several pipes protruding from it, as well as levers and circular cranks. "Come, come," said Flame, beckoning his guests forward. "I hope you all appreciate my wonder," he laughed. "Do we finally get to test it?" Fath looked for a moment before replying. "Can we at least put wheels on it?" Flame brightened up instantly. "Of course! Wheels! Yes, wheels! Wheels would get it from one place to another." And he danced around another corner. Fath looked to Cap. "See to it, and then bring it to the entrance." Ezost quickened his pace across the Slade Cavern floors, all the while glancing into the glowing pits as they passed them. He was more than halfway to his destination, but there were sightings from his demon allies that the dwarves were amassing some sort of raiding party at the entrance to Archcrystal, and they couldn't have known of his plan. He thought still, coincidence was too troublesome to ignore. "Gather some of the brethren," Azos hissed. "Kill as many dwarves as you can and make sure they do not come anywhere near us." 2 groups of demons glanced sideways to each other momentarily before gathering a large group to head towards the fortress. The largest dwarven war party the world had ever seen now gathered at the entrance to Hell. Word had spread quickly about the scouting party Fath intended to lead, and it quickly twisted its meaning through rumor into invasion. Thousands of dwarves spilled out of the entrance, and most were immigrants, of course, escaping their precarious living situations in the Glass Tower. Most of them had grown up on stories of the dwarves invading Hell, and they were too far removed from the events to know any of the tragedy that accompanied those tales. Nevertheless, they were martially trained and well fed at least, and they were joined by the siege engineers pulling ballistas and loaded with adamantine-tipped missiles. And finally, by one strange machine pulled by a large group of dwarves. Gearg, Immerk, Sam, and Splint all shoved the machine slowly forward. It was on wheels, but was the heaviest thing that they'd ever encountered. "Did you have to make this thing out of lead?" Garg barked. "It's mostly lead," Flame smiled behind them. He was tending to the long adamantine tubes protruding from the machine that were snaking their way to the large steel tanks of liquid. These were pushed along behind the main machine and had valves at the front to operate them. One tank for magma and one for war. Gitzo turned to Cap and asked, "So this is just a magma furnace on wheels?" "It uses the same principles, but it's just the power source as far as I can tell. What happens when he turns it on is anybody's guess," replied Cap. Behind them were Crafter, Sanctum, and Shimmy, preparing their new fancy armor and handing out new rations they had prepared. Minced Hydra brain jerky had become a delicacy in the fortress, and they were welcomed wherever they went. Livos accepted both the jerky and moved alongside of Sultrangus, who was pushing the other tank of liquid. Both of them had been forcefully volunteered for the task. "Do you know where we're going?" asked Sultrangus. "I'm not sure," replied Levos. Apparently, they discovered something important in one of the pits that the nobles want. The large host of dwarven soldiers and war machines began to move ahead along the newly constructed glass road leading to the north. The glassmakers were quickly laying down each brick with the ancient technique they had perfected. It was a slow and steady pace that made the soldiers nervous, and that was with good reason. A scout reported that there was a large group of demons approaching from the northeast. "They seem well organized again," said the scout. "It seems like they've taken our lessons to heart. Good thing we have so many volunteers." The scout flashed a wicked grin and loaded his crossbow. Meanwhile, Izost reached his destination. It was a large barren plateau of Slade with a small glowing pit in the center. Surrounding it were other pits of varying sizes that glowed just as eerily, but he moved straight for the one in the middle. He stopped a few meters from it and waited before the demons that waited with him glanced around unknowingly. Then, to their complete surprise, creatures began to climb out of the pit. Usually, if something ventured too close to a glowing pit, it was like gravity increased 10 times and pulled whatever unfortunate thing down into eternity. So it was a shock to all but Ezost that these figures emerged from one of them. They looked like demons, but had different features and humanoid forms. They had armor and weapons of strikingly alien metals that reflected light strangely. And when one of them spoke, it was with a booming voice that echoed across the plateau. "Why do you come here, Ezost Shasragador, Baibar Banik?" Ezost snarled. "Have you been not paying attention? Do you know what goes on out here? No, of course you don't. You're content to let us handle the dwarves." The glowing figure gave Ezost a quizzical look. "The dwarves? Is the endless demon army not enough for you? Are infinite numbers and infinite time not enough for you? The dwarves do not concern us. Their fortress will fall like every other, despite this one's longevity." "That is what I said until they came for me. They came for everyone. They will come for you as well," and said Ezost, pointing a clawed talon at them. "Everyone else from the beginning is dead by their hands. It is only a matter of time before they are on your doorstep as well." Ezost clenched both of his fists towards his chest. "This was supposed to be ours, and I will not be the design of something else, especially not them." The glowing figure smirked. "I think you give them too much credit, or perhaps we give you too much. No matter. Remember, we have all the time in the world, and I'm not being hyperbolic. The sound of distant explosions carried from the south caused a low rumble and vibration that echoed off the jagged cliffs. Even far away, the sounds of battle were unmistakable, and muted screams carried out on the dry wind. "Do you hear that?" asked Ezost. "I think every drop of that time is about to run out." The figures simply shook their head. "I don't care what you think. We will not help you in your fight, because it is your fight, remember?" Ezos clenched his jaw. "I don't want your help fighting them. I need to come with you. I need to see Armok." A silence passed over the gathering, and the uneasy tension turned razor-sharp suddenly. "That is not possible, demon. You cannot break our agreement." "Watch me," growled Ezost. To the south, some of the fiercest hand-to-hand fighting ever seen by the dwarves was taking place. Ballista bolts fired in unison tore their way through advancing demon formations. Demons the size of large trees crashed into armored phalanxes of dwarves, sending some of them flying through the air, end over end, and the steel of each dwarf scraped against each other as they were pushed relentlessly by the horde of demon muscle clawing its way forward. Catapults from the rear hurled giant rocks of Galana down into the fray, sending forth a thunderous sound that echoed everywhere. The last of the cave dragons also charged into battle, biting and clawing at the mess of demon flesh in front of them. Even some of the tamed hydras were thrown into the chaos. For once, the battle was not looking good for the dwarves of Archcrystal. Their numbers were greater, but they were exposed out here, so far away from their fortress. The minecarts couldn't fire this far, and there were no walls and fortifications to provide any cover. It was a theater that favored the demons immensely, and it was beginning to show. Gearg, Imak, and Sam and Splint moved the machine into position. With a nod to Livos and Sultrangus, the valves on the magma tanks were turned, and the tubes connecting them to the machine began to glow bright red. The machine belched and sputtered for a moment, but then hummed to life as the magma-powered gears began to turn. The 3 large cylinders at the front began to turn faster and faster until they had achieved their desired speed and centrifugal force. The sound of lead balls rolling into the cylinders was music to the ears of Flame, who reveled watching his machine come to life. The centrifuges threw lead shot through the slit in the front the very instant they came into contact with one another. The sound of battle suddenly changed from battle cries and clashing steel to the sound of thousands of projectiles whizzing through the air, punctuated by thuds and pings when they found a home. There was almost no aiming the machine. It had one target, forward, and everything within a 60-degree cone of it was being torn to shreds by its merciless rate of fire. Dwarves and demons alike scrambled for cover, but the open battlefield that once favored the demons now favored nothing. At last, the machine slowed to a halt, and the air grew quiet. It was a heavy silence. Usually, after a battle, there were cries for help or cheers of victory, but not this time. The battlefield was deathly still for many uncomfortable moments before the dwarves organized themselves and began taking stock of their losses. 2,000 dwarves perished that day. The demons did not fare any better, but Fath knew that this was a devastating loss to the identity of Archcrystal, and in a war of attrition, the dwarves would surely lose. As the remaining dwarves moved their dead, several of the commanders were discussing the path ahead with Fath, whose temper had started to boil over. He was always furious at any kind of loss, and even though it was technically a victory, this one stung. "There might be more on the way," said Gitzo. "What will we do if they attack again? I don't think we have the numbers to repel another wave like that, unless we turn that bloody machine on again." He shivered. Fath tried to think through his anger. I have an idea, said Fath. It's that the demons feel no fear. Let's put that to the test. Gather 100 or so of the demons and try to find the ones that are still clinging to life if you can. I want the ones that can bleed. Fath walked over to one that was still twitching slightly. Like this one. He pointed. Fath took out his knife and started carving a symbol into its torso. Is that supposed to scare them? Gitzo asked. Fath smirked and continued working. No, this is just for my own personal satisfaction. I'm just being petty. The two winged demons watched the dwarves gather their dead from a safe distance to the north. They had been sent by Ezost to spy on their progress and hadn't seen the battle, but they could definitely see the aftermath. They looked on to see the dwarves also lining up several of the fallen demons on the sides of the newly built glass road, which was now steadily being built again. Let's report back to Ezost. He will want to know the outcome quickly, hissed Etar. Wait, I want to see what they're doing first, replied Ozist. Fine, but Ezost will want to know how many are left, and I don't think he will be pleased, said Etur, as he sat down to watch as well. We are infinite in number, remember? Etur's eye narrowed. Are you sure did you ever count? The dry wind blew and kicked up the slade dust silently as Etur looked around him. If you ask me, it's looking a little empty around here lately. Quiet, snarled Ozist. They're getting ready to move again. They watched as the dwarven force began to march forward. They had attached the chains to the demons' bodies that were pulled up by the cave dragons and hyenas as they marched 100 crucifixes, all evenly spaced along the new road, were lifted to stand tall as they passed by. Some of the crucified demons who were still alive writhed in agony as gravity pulled hard on their mangled flesh. The animals were also encouraged to nip at their wounds as they passed, causing them to cry out in deafening shrieks that carried along the wind. Etur and Ozist glanced at each other apprehensively for a moment before taking off to fly towards Izost, and it was a short flight because they made good time from the tailwind at their backs before landing in front of their master. They looked around the plateau at another battle that had seemingly taken place. Master, hissed Etur, you killed the angels? Our negotiations failed, but never mind that, growled Izost. What do you have to report? Our brethren were defeated, as you predicted, but they killed many and delayed them. They will most likely be here within the hour, replied Etur. It will have to be enough, says Ezost. Take these bodies and toss them into the pits. I don't want the dwarves to get their dirty hands on these weapons. Ozist glanced again at Etur before speaking. There is one more thing, master. They are torturing our fallen brethren. The fallen are crucified and eaten alive. We are cautious about facing such a foe. They also carved a symbol into each of their bodies. A number, but I don't know what it means. Ezos frowned. Why? What are the numbers? Ozit squinted his dark eyes and shook his head. They were all 5. Fath stepped onto the Slade Plateau and looked around. There were recent signs of battle here, and he noted the pools of blood that stained the ground. It was similar to any of the other desolate spots in Hell, but after looking at it more closely, he could see why Edzul singled it out. In his hurried notes, it was almost symmetrical, and there were glowing pits around the edges. The pit at the center looked too central to be random, and he walked up to the pit in the center and looked down. It glowed like any other and seemed to do the same, so Fath decided to test it. He threw a small stone into it, and it fell normally until it was out of sight. Curiously, he got down on his stomach at the edge of the pit and grabbed a handful of dust. He blew it out of his hand, and it carried across the opening. Fath smiled and stood up, brushing himself off. "What is it?" asked Cap. "The dust didn't get sucked into the pit. It carried across it and floated normally. This isn't a normal pit," replied Fath, walking over to one of the wagons. "So what does it mean?" inquired Gitzo. "It means we're going down," said Fath. "I need some cranes constructed quickly, and tell the glassmakers I need them to start making stairs down into the pit." Gitzo's eyes grew a little wide, but he went on carrying out his orders. The glassmakers approached the pit cautiously and slowly placed the first clear glass block into place at the edge of the pit. They all winced as they lowered it below the plane of the opening, but nothing happened. It was true, it didn't operate like the rest for some reason, and they set about building the stairs downward. Georg and Immick and Sam and Splint pushed the machine towards the opening and then started to plan the construction of the cranes that would lower it down. "I thought hell was the bottom, and now we're going beneath it?" Georg shook his head. "What did you think? It just stopped here? Of course there's something beneath it. It had to be, right?" replied Immick. "Does it have to be? Eventually things have to end, don't they?" said Sam. A low tremor shook the ground slowly, and they all looked around for a moment before continuing their work. "I don't think whatever is beneath us wants us here," Splint said, smirking. Georg chuckled. "I doubt hell wants us here, or anywhere else for that matter. But we'll go anyway and make ourselves at home. It's what we do." Fath waited impatiently at the edge of the pit until finally the glassmakers came up with newly created stairs. "You had better come and see this," they said, and he walked down with them for 100 meters until they came upon a large opening. It was hidden from above by a series of small overhangs and ledges. Almost deliberately, a dozen steps into the opening loomed a towering door. It was made of steel and it stood slightly ajar, and upon closer inspection, it was recently smashed open on the left side by a powerful force of some kind. Fath turned to Gitzo. "Bring everyone down here and tell them to hurry with the cranes as well." A few hundred dwarves slowly descended down the glass staircase with their eyes wide open. Cap wondered quietly if the first dwarves who ever descended into hell had a similar experience, but as they reached the large steel door, he realizes this was something even more unique. Fath nodded to a few of the soldiers. "Open it." It took 30 dwarves with metal levers to pry open the door. It creaked loud groans as it opened, clearly unaccustomed to use. Beyond was a sight that was difficult to comprehend. It was a long hallway, about 10 meters high, and equally wide, made of solid steel. The steel was polished and slightly reflective, like a dull mirror. The hallway extended forwards as far as they could see. On the floor were several dead bodies of demons, and others that looked like demons, but had strange armor and weapons, made of metals the dwarves had never seen before. More fighting had obviously occurred here, and there were clearly two sides to the conflict now. The dwarves crept forward slowly down the large hallway, regarding the bodies as they went, and Cap walked alongside of Fath down the smooth corridor. "You know, I've listened to you give sermons," said Cap. "I've seen you there," nodded Fath. "You think this is it?" asked Cap. "You think this is Armok?" Fath took a deep breath in. "Maybe. I've always thought that Armok was us, or at least that's the way it should be. We should be the creators and the directors and the designers. But I must admit, it's kind of comforting to think that there's a creator behind all of this mess." Cap snorted as he stepped over a corpse. A mess indeed. I don't know if I'd find it as comforting to know if there was a creator for all of this. I mean, look around you. It is a big mess. Suffering everywhere, war, demons, goddamn elves, disease, hell children with disease. Why would anyone make that? And if Armok did make it all, what do they do with it? Watch it? It doesn't seem right, if you ask me. So why would you believe in someone like that? A few moments later, the dwarven column ahead of them stopped. There was a large pile of dead bodies in the center of the corridor, and the lead dwarves were inspecting them. Gitzo went over to one of the corpses and inspected its helmet. It was made of a yellow metal that glowed like nothing he'd ever seen. As he stepped towards it, he felt the floor beneath give way until he heard a quiet click. Suddenly, metal strands burst forth from the walls and floor and ceiling, ripping through the corpses in their way, and the metal strands all met at a point in the middle of the hallway and began to form a large sphere. Trap! Get da! Before the shout finished leaving Gitzo's mouth, a bolt of lightning shot out of the center of the sphere, burning a large hole into his chest. The lightning jumped instantly from dwarf to dwarf, searing their flesh, and a few dozen at the front fell lifeless to the steel floor. Screams of agony ripped through the hallway as more lightning shot forth into the dwarven formation. The rest scrambled for cover at the sides or behind other dead bodies on the floor of the passageway. At last, the lightning struck something that didn't fall. Moril Bysuk, the largest and eldest cave dragon of Archcrystal, shook off the strike after strike of electricity from the floating metal sphere. As he stomped forwards, its scales began to hiss and smoke with every blast. But still he moved forward, propelled by centuries of growth and care, until it was 30 centimeters in front of the sphere of death. If an inanimate floating metal sphere could blink, it did now. Moril Bysuk let out a thundering roar that lasted nearly a full minute, spraying saliva and vociferous sound everywhere. In front of him, for a moment, everything paused, and then he clamped down on the horrible flying trap with jaws that pierced everything. The sound now was a crunch of ancient teeth scraping against metal, and a slow, muffled satisfaction of a beast rumbling through the corridor. Fath stood up from his crouched position alongside of Cap, who did not get up. He looked down and saw Cap sputtering blood through his wheezing coughs. There was a singed hole in his abdomen, and an arterial blood was leaking onto the steel floor. Cap coughed. "See!" His voice was barely a whisper. "Why would you?" And Fath stood up slowly and turned away as Cap died. Fath shrugged. "That sounds like something I would do." Fath strode forward to the front of the decimated column, and the remaining dwarves were attempting medical care on the dying. "Leave them," said Fath. "We have to catch up to whomever was here before us, and judging by these bodies, we aren't far behind." One by one, the dwarves slowly abandoned the dying, closing their senses to the last breaths of the fatally wounded. "Also," added Fath, "we should let the cave dragons go first." He glanced at Moril Bysuk, who obeyed with ancient practice. At last, they came to a large room. Steel walls glimmered with a hidden light source that reflected the sounds of the fading battle. Ezost crouched at the end of the room with a wounded figure in his claws, and another figure standing with a bright sword before him. The demon lunged towards the figure with the sword while tossing away the other. Ezost absorbed the strike to his torso and clamped down with his front claws on its legs and neck. In the next instant, he tore the being in half and threw the severed pieces against the walls to splatter and drip slowly down its sleek metal. Ezost breathed heavily afterwards, and his wounds bled profusely into the cold metal floor. His breathing was slow and labored, and now, as he glanced towards Fath at the entrance to the room, "Now of all times," Ezost wheezed. "Why now?" It was more of a ponderous statement than a question, He bled more and coughed while he struggled for the cold, dry air. But still he raised himself, confident in his strength and ferocious ability to cling to life. That was tempered by infinite time. "You dwarves had hundreds of years to find this place, but you come here at this hour. Who told you? Are there more spies than I guessed?" Ezos slowly regained his strength and regenerated as he spoke. Perhaps he could still stand for a moment longer before he struck. Fath entered the room, and it was only him and Ezos now. The demon crouched, awaiting an attack, but the dwarf in front of him simply stepped to one side. "I'm not sure what you mean," Fath replied. The confident dwarf unfolded a wooden chair and table and sat down in a large steel room patiently. "What was your name again?" Ezos tried to breathe, slowly, without pain for a moment. He attempted to disregard Fath's baited question, and the demon could see more dwarves moving into place along the corridor, while he waited for an attack. He just needed a little longer to regain his strength. "Do you have any idea of what is in this place?" asked Ezos, gesturing behind him at a huge steel cylinder. "Or are you still like a child stumbling into importance? I should give you death here and save you from what lies beyond. The immensity of it would crush you regardless." Fath had been writing as Ezos spoke and continued to outline the features of Ezos on his parchment. "Will it now?" said Fath, without looking up. "When I find out, I'll tell you all about it. And yes, I do know what it is there." Fath looked up at Ezos. "It's Armok." The demon's eyes flashed, and his posture stiffened. Confusion swirled through his mind. How? He tried to project a controlled exterior, and the wound on his chest was closing quickly. He was almost ready. "Then bring your mighty dwarves in here, and we will see who gives the lesson." Fath stood up. "Oh, they won't be doing anything." Fath folded his table and chain and tucked them under his arm. The machine entered the room, scraping against the sides of the doorway, sending sparks and metallic shrieks into the room. Ezos stared unknowingly at it for a moment as Fath exited into the hallway. Its centrifuges were already at full speed. "You won't get..." Ezos began to yell. But whatever words came next faded into oblivion as the machine spewed hundreds of metal shots into the room. Fath heard screams and then nothing at all. After the machine powered down, the dwarves entered the large room and surveyed the destruction inside. The chamber was awash in bodily fluids, red, yellow, black, and bright blue even. Some appendages could be identified, but almost everything else looked like ground beef on the floor. The lead pellets barely even scuffed the polished steel walls of the place, and Fath walked over to the giant metal cylinder at the end of the room. There was a latch on one side, and Fath pulled it, and the front of the cylinder slid open to reveal an even smaller circular room. The dwarves all peered inside. The room was empty, except for a small lever at the end, and Fath walked over to inspect it. Soltrangus crouched closer to the floor. "I think this platform is supposed to move." He looked up, and judging by the solid-looking ceiling up there, I'm betting it goes down. Fath nodded. "Let me try it first." "Whatever is down there, even demons were afraid of it. If I don't come back, leave this place and seal it forever. And make sure it's never found again." "Fath, are you sure you want to do this?" asked Soltrangus. Fath smirked. "Nope, but I'll do it anyways." He slid the door closed and pulled the lever. The ancient mechanisms cracked into life, and the platform shuddered for a second before beginning to move down. He descended for what seemed like an impossibly long time before coming to a halt. Satisfied that there was no more movement from the platform, he opened the door. All he could see was darkness. Beyond, and he stepped out cautiously into it. He could see nothing above or below him. It was all bathed in a strange blackness. The ground seemed solid enough, whatever it was made of. In front of him, he could see something, and it was tiny or it was just far away. He couldn't tell if it looked like a small white speck floating in the middle of the blackness, almost as if a wayward grain of salt found its way here, to the stain an otherwise perfect darkness. He felt drawn to it and moved closer slowly. Fath reached out a hand towards it and felt the pull on him. It continued to increase until it surrounded his entire body. "Armok?" he whispered. And then everything that Fath ever was, or ever would be, purposely moved forwards into the immense design of things. Epilogue. The two human soldiers, Olot and Artuk, moved through the dense jungle, hacking away at the foliage as they went. They had been ordered to find a path for the rest of the army, through the valley by the river. "We must be close now," said Olot, turning to look behind him. Artuk scanned the ground. "I think you're right. Look at the ground. This must be the old road to the fortress." The ground indeed showed signs of stonework that had grown over and been hidden by vegetation. "Why do we even have to find Archcrystal anyways? The dwarves of that empire are all gone now," said Olot. An entire dwarven civilization conquered almost the entire world and then disappears overnight. "And you aren't curious as to why," said Artuk. Olot brushed a huge phantom spider off of his sleeve. "Well, yes, but I'm not sure why we need an army with us." "Can't be too careful," smiled Artuk, "and it should be up ahead where the two rivers meet. I think I see a break in the trees up here." They came to the edge of the tree line and looked ahead of them to an open space. There stood a glass tower of Archcrystal, projecting a long, oppressive shadow against the late afternoon sun. Strangely, the jungle had not even tried to reclaim the fortress, or the land around it. There was a large, wide circle of dirt where nothing grew surrounding it. In the dirt, there were several shambling figures, walking back and forth mindlessly. "Undead?" asked Olot. "Don't see many of them anymore. Are they dwarves?" "Looks like goblins to me, but it's hard to tell from up here," replied Artuk. "I'll go in for a closer look, and you go tell the others to get up here. They shouldn't be far behind if they found the old road." Olot nodded and moved back into the jungle while Artuk stepped forward slowly and cautiously into the clearing. As he got closer, the undead stopped moving and turned towards him in unison. One of the goblins' corpses stepped through the middle of them and surprisingly began to speak. "A human," it hissed. "Know that this place is not for the living. Only death lurks here now." Artuk looked at the creature closely, and it was covered in a dull blue dust. "Well, time marches on, doesn't it? And I'm afraid your time is over, so, kindly shamble aside, and there won't be any trouble." "Arrogant humor. I will enjoy eating your—" The 50 caliber bullet struck the undead creature in the upper torso with 15,000 foot-pounds of force and 20,000 joules of energy. In the same instant, it created an expanding body cavity that pushed all of the organic material of the upper body towards it until it mystified. Whatever necromantic energies that had held the rest of the body together were obliterated, and the rest of the mutilated corpse flew backwards in several directions. And the M2 machine gun continued firing at a pace of 1,200 rounds a minute at the rest of the undead until there was nothing left moving. "Cease fire!" shouted the commander from the tree line, and Artuk got up from the ground that he had flattened against. "You could have given me an earlier heads up," he said wearingly. The bulldozers began pushing the trees down to allow the trucks to make their way into the clearing. In the distance, a blue mist began moving into the clearing. "Masks!" yelled the commander. And Artuk put on a gas mask with the rest of them, and the cloud passed by and drifted into the jungle. He slung his rifle onto his shoulder and approached the entrance with Olot. The glass tower loomed taller above as they got closer. "Well, it doesn't really look far up," quipped Olot, smiling behind his mask. "Oh, we're not going up," replied Artuk. They moved inside of the entranceway and looked down through the clear glass floor. The tower stood like a dagger, remained plunged into the center of the world. It hummed and pulsed with a dim glow again as it welcomed life inside it once more, and until the end of time. Thank you very much for listening to these final chapters of Archcrystal. If you've made it this far and you're still listening, I just want to say a real quick thank you and shoutouts to Sethados for finishing this wonderful story. If you would like to download and read the entire thing, once again, there's a link down in the description where you can grab that. It's just a PDF file. You can read the whole thing yourself. It's just on the DF database. If you've never been on that website before, the Dwarf Fortress File Depot, sorry. It's a big old place where people store files for Dwarf Fortress and things related to Dwarf Fortress, such as mods and save files. So there's a link in the description where you can grab this. And the next major project I'm working on in this fashion is, Boat Murdered. So you may have heard of it. If you like this kind of thing and you would like to see more of it, check out this YouTube channel and support the Patreon if you want to see more big projects like this. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.